If you're building some cloud infrastructure, like in our case, HPC clusters for science and engineering, or ultra clusters of GPUs for training machine learning models, very obviously, you want to make sure everything is done to make sure it's secure. That means keeping the dirty mitts of bad guys away from your cluster nodes. One of the best ways to do that is to just not let any traffic through firewalls. But then how do you SSH into the head node to do admin stuff, or, submit jobs to your cluster? Our engineering team is fond of using AWS Systems Manager for this. It has a very cool feature for proxying SSH connections through a secure tunnel, and we use it all the time. Your local SSH tools work the same, and you'll get exactly the same command line experience. But in the middle, SSM is brokering a connection using your AWS creds. You have a lot more control over who can connect to any of your EC2 instances. Your EC2 instances have no direct exposure to the internet, and you have a single place where you can revoke authority and connectivity to all those clusters and the resources they harness if you need to. Today, I'll show you how to enable this, and it'll only take a few minutes. I'm going to do this on my Mac. It's practically the same process on a Linux system, and if you're using a Windows desktop, check the documentation links as we go along. You'll need an IAM user with credentials that you use for your day-to-day stuff, and you'll need the SSM agents to be installed on your EC2 instances. If you use Amazon Linux as your distro, they're included by default. And if you're smart enough to have used the recipes from the HPC recipe library to spin up your parallel clusters, then you've already got this stuff too. There's a link up there to another video where we talk about the library and how to use it to do some very sensible build out of well-designed infrastructure. Now, to enable your IAM users access to this feature, you need to create an IAM policy. I promise it won't hurt. Go to this webpage and copy this blob of JSON. Next, open your console, head to IAM. Find your user. Under the Permissions tab, open the Add Permissions menu and choose the inline editor. Then click on the JSON button here so you can drop that blob of text from your clipboard into the editor. But don't save it yet. You need to make a couple of changes first. You'll notice that the editor is flagging that the line 8 here has an issue. That's because, checking the web page we stole this from, you need to fill in the region, account ID, and instance ID that your user is allowed to connect to through SSM. You could absolutely specify this down to a single account in a single region and a specific instance. If you only want this person, or this automation you're setting up, to ever access a single instance, this is how you do it. If you're an admin looking after a whole bunch of instances in a specific region, a fairly normal pattern, then you could specify the region and the account and leave a wildcard in the instance ID part. Incidentally, you can find your 12-digit account ID in this menu, and we've even put a little copy button next to it to save you another click. Now, if you're me and you've got a few clusters in a few regions, then you might also want to use a wildcard for the region too. As it stands now, this is an IAM policy associated with my IAM user, which allows that properly authenticated IAM user, that's me, to use AWS SSM's start session endpoint to kick up an SSH session using SSM as a proxy. When you're done with the typing and you're clear of any red syntax alerts, click Next and Create Policy. Now I'm ready to set things up on my Mac. I've already got the AWS CLI installed, and if you don't have it already, check the documentation for that here, or just Google AWS CLI. Now, we're almost done, so stick with me another couple of minutes. You need to add the SSM plugin to your laptop. Go to this page, and I'm on a Mac, so I'll go here. I'm using Apple Silicon, so I need this one. Paste this into my shell, like so. Unzip stuff, copy the install command from here, paste this into my shell, and it's done. And it's created a directory in user local session manager and a link in user local bin, so you don't have to fiddle about fixing up your path for every damn shell that you use. We're only a few feet from the finishing line now, which is probably the time for me to insert a word from our sponsor to tell you about this amazing new brand of toothpaste that will change your life. But I won't. I'm not that kind of guy. You can thank me later. Now, the last thing that we need to do is to go back to the same page we plagiarized earlier and steal this little blob of goodness, which we're going to add to our SSH config file. Copy it. Now we go back to our shell. We cd into our SSH directory. We'll use our favorite superior editor to open the config file. Now, unless you're an animal, you should have a config file for SSH already. And if you don't, and you're some kind of barbarian from the Middle Ages, you're seriously missing out on some quality of life improvements. We'll talk about that later in therapy. For now, drop your clipboard into the file. We'll come back to this in a minute so I can sort out the masochists amongst you. Now, once this is in there, This tells SSH that any host names matching this glob here should use this proxy command, which effectively routes the SSH request through a tunnel that SSM creates, if you have permission to do so. And that permission comes from all that fiddling about we did a minute ago with our policy that we attached to our IAM user. Now, we should be able to grab the instance name for a host from our EC2 console like this, and drop it into our shell and do an SSH like this. We just SSH EC2 user at our long instance name, and look at that. Magic. If you need to specify a separate PEM file with your SSH key and credentials in it, you just do it like you normally would with an SSH-i and the path to your PEM file. But now it's time to talk to those masochists out there. The config file in SSH is magical. It has the capacity to add some sanity to your day by doing some creature comfort things that save you a lot of typing, and a lot of nonsense remembering things like PEM files. Seriously. For the example I just showed you, you would use something like this, where I tell SSH that the next time I try to connect to a host called, say, Bruce, then connect to this proxy command that drops this specific instance name in the right place and gets busy creating a secure tunnel. Oh, and while we're talking about Bruce like this, use the username EC2 user so I don't have to type that thing every time as well. And use this PEM file that I've put here so I never have to type that nonsense either or remember this association again. Now I can just type SSH Bruce and stuff happens, and I have a shell open to my favorite head node, and his name is Bruce. Isn't that just nicer? Can you see this making your life more pleasant? We're not done yet. This line up here, the host star glob, says to send an SSH no-op down the pipe every 60 seconds to the terminal at the other end, so it doesn't time me out. I go away, I grab coffee number 7, and when I get back, I've been timed out by some needy, annoying shell at the other end. Kills me. This line brought the forces of nature into harmony for me. It's also an example of the fact that rules in these SSH config files are cumulative. You can layer them, like in this example here from Stack Exchange, supplied by a very nice person from the historical time of 2014 when instances were all made of wood. So you can now safely remove port 22 from your security groups, and you'll still be able to connect. If you're connecting to a head node created by Parallel Cluster, you can just tell Parallel Cluster not to allow console access anymore. And you can raise the drawbridge on your firewalls, security groups, or VPCs, and keep the bad guys from knowing there's a there. These are not the nodes you're looking for. And I feel that having taught you how to name a head node Bruce, my task here is complete. See you in the cloud.